Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about why teens argue. So, this is a common problem with parents and teenagers, and there's a lot of reasons for that we're going to talk about. So, adolescence, I think, sometimes could be called the time of great disputations. So, a lot of times kids are easier going during younger middle childhood. It depends a little bit on personality, but then they sort of hit this, tween teen age, and all of a sudden they're just not as easygoing as they were. They have a lot more opinions and they're starting to disagree with their parents more. So there can be a number of reasons for that. Sometimes they are kind of testing their power, they're testing their ability to debate. They've moved into that abstract reasoning that we talked about last week, and so they're testing out their ability to think abstractly and to disagree with things. They're realizing that their parents aren't as knowledgeable as maybe they thought they were. There's in Untangled by Lisa D'Amour, she describes it as like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy realizes that the wizard is actually just a human being, and teens start to realize, oh, hey, my parents, maybe they don't know everything. Maybe I know everything. And so that can cause a lot of arguments. There's also a lot of conflicts of interest, as teens become teenagers. Our job as parents is to protect them, and their job is to push away and to become independent and to figure things out for themselves. And so that can also lead to a lot of conflict. I want to clarify that when I talk about conflict or arguing, that can show up in a lot of different ways. Some teens are more argumentative and they will literally fight with you. Other teens are a little bit more passive aggressive, and so it can show up in like eye rolling and sarcasm and ignoring you, ignoring texts, or sending back random little comments that are meant to kind of fire you up. And so some teens might, like I said, they might really enjoy arguing, and some might be a little bit quieter, more passive aggressive about that. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But first, I kind of want to give 11 tips for when your teen is trying to pull you into an argument. So I'm going to say pull you into an argument because as parents, we always have the choice as to whether or not we are going to react or whether we're going to react in the way that they hope that we're going to react. So here's just really quick 11 tips that I was just thinking about that might be helpful to you. So number one is to realize your teen is struggling. Even if you don't know all that's going on underneath, teenage years are tough, so just keep that in mind. Number two, I have a tendency to do this, or to not do this, and that's to treat the arguments seriously. So a lot of times teens seem like they're arguing about just the silliest things, but when we blow it off, we don't take it seriously, we roll our eyes, we whatever at them, then it can teach them that they might be embarrassed or ridiculed, or they might start to think that their opinions don't matter. Number three is avoid the winning and losing mindset. So as parents, we often fall into this too. We don't want our teens to quote unquote win. And so sometimes pride gets involved and we see that there's a winning or losing side, and we think that if we allow our teen to quote unquote win this one, then they're just going to walk all over us. And so we're hesitant to kind of quote unquote give in. But as soon as you move into that mindset, you've pretty much lost because they're probably not going to give up. Depends on your team. Four, know that your teen, just go into it knowing that your teen will ramp things up. They are gonna turn up the heat. They're gonna once you get going, it can be hard to calm things back down. Just be prepared for it. Number five is if the disagreement is one that you've already had before, just hold your ground. Don't get pulled into it again. Just say, we've talked about this, I haven't changed my mind. If you want to give me some new evidence or whatever it is, let's talk about it rationally later, but I am not going to argue about this again. Number six, actively listen and wait it out. We talked about that last week. Number seven, try adding humor. It can diffuse the situation, but I want to clarify that is maybe a little bit later in the conversation, and make sure that it's not in a mocking or sarcastic way that will make your teen feel embarrassed or ridiculed. Number eight, add a practical element. So when your teen or you are both starting to get worked up a little bit, sometimes it can be good to cool back and move to the logical side of your brain. And something like, if you're arguing over whether or not your teen can say go to a party, you can ask, what time was the party? Who's going to be there? Where is it going to be? Just to calm both of you back down if you're getting stuck, to really look back at the practical element. Nine, watch for hot potatoes. This is when your teen will intentionally say something really inflammatory because they want you to feel the emotion because they're uncomfortable and they don't know how. So decide if you're going to allow that, if you're not going to allow that. Just kind of learn a little bit more about that and watch for it, and then set boundaries if you're not willing to allow them to cause you to react. Or sometimes it's you can tell they're really upset, and if it will help them for you to feel that emotion with them, then you can do that as well. Number 10, limit the arguments to things that your teen has introduced. If they veer off track, bring it in. So this happens with my teen sometimes. We don't really fight, but she gets in these mindsets of this is how things are, and then she starts bringing in all of these random things and that have nothing to do with the topic. So if we're talking about screens, and all of a sudden it's well, you didn't let me do this, or I don't want to do this, or whatever it is. And so you have to just kind of bring it back in and keep them from getting distracted you. Finally, close things off by repeating what they said back to them and ask if you can help solve the problem if there is one. And so this is a matter of just kind of, if you're done, you're going in circles, repeat what they have said back to them, and then close it off and come back to it another day. So an interesting thing to know is that we tend to mirror each other in social interactions, and so this happens in arguments as well. We often imitate each other without even realizing that we're doing it. So if your teen blames you, comes into the conversation blaming you, it's a lot easier to then flip and blame them. Or if your teen thinks that you're being unreasonable, then sometimes it's easy to just then turn it around and say that, well, you're being unreasonable. No, you're being unreasonable. No, you're bringing unreasonable. So it's up to you to kind of start to model healthy boundary setting and emotion management. Of course, that's easier said than done. But here's just a couple behaviors and boundaries that you might want to teach your teen. 1 is sticking to specifics. 2 is staying on topic. 3 is making accurate statements that aren't inflammatory. 4, listening to understand. 5, not interrupting. 6, remaining rational. 7, acting empathetic. And 8, talking in a calm voice. So those are 8 skills that you can model for your teen as you're going through arguments. Here's a couple of things you can say if you want to avoid an argument with your teen. I need you to do this by the time your friend comes. I hear what you're saying, and I'm thankful that you told me. I don't have the energy to talk about this right now. Let's talk tonight. Or sometimes I say to my teen, if you want an answer now, the answer is no. If you want me to think about it, let's talk about it later. Ask questions like, can I give you my point of view? You don't have to change your mind if you don't agree. So it's just kind of getting to know your teen, knowing how they argue and that sort of thing, and then just kind of trying to nip it in the bud. But then also realizing that if you do get pulled into an argument, there's nothing wrong with conflict and argument necessarily. It's the way that you do it. And so those 8 things that I just listed, as you're disagreeing with your teen, those are some ways that you can teach them, I guess, how to disagree with people and how to have a good argument. So kind of the last thing I want to talk about is a lot of times we think it's good if our teens don't disagree or don't argue. And that can be the case, but I want to talk about for a minute the danger of, I'm going to call it the curse of the good girl. It can definitely happen with boys, but there's an interesting book I read that I might do a whole week on the curse of the good girl because it was a very interesting book. But I just kind of want to talk about a few things that you're aware of. So sometimes girls or boys, they believe that confrontation will ruin a relationship. And so they hide their emotions, they hide their thoughts, they agree on the outside, they outwardly nod, but inwardly disagree. And in some ways, even though it's hard, I'd rather my teen push back and tell me what they're thinking and tell me what they're feeling than to hide it and you not know about it. And it can either explode later or they feel like they have to be perfect. And so we want to avoid making our teens feel like they have to be perfect. And so a lot of times you can see this when they're waiting for you to guess their emotions or waiting for their friends to guess their emotions, because if you guess, then they don't have to tell you how they're feeling. It gives kind of an illusion of control where you have to write the script. You're trying to get them to talk, you're asking questions, you're pushing them, whatever, and so they don't have to really talk about what they're really feeling or what they're thinking inside. This sometimes happens when people feel like they have too much shame or guilt. They can't open up and talk about things that are really important to them, and so they will hide their feelings and hide their emotions, hide their thoughts, because they're afraid to make mistakes. It can happen when you have a fixed mindset as opposed to a growth mindset. They sometimes make a lot of assumptions or will try and get you to make assumptions so that they don't have to be clear in their communication. They will be very sometimes what's the word? I don't know, they just feel like they can't be themselves. So they might have trouble with relationships or trouble being real. You see a lot of kind of fake behaviors, maybe passive aggressiveness and some things like that. Sometimes us moms have grown up with this good girl syndrome as well, and so we feel like if our kids fight, then we're failing as a parent, and so that can cause us to show up and react in a different way. So this is just kind of we'll probably talk more about this later, but we want to avoid teaching our teens that conflict is a threat to relationships and that we need to sacrifice our own needs, sacrifice our own thoughts, sacrifice who we are, our individuality, in an attempt to keep the peace. So I hope this was helpful to you, and we will talk about it more this week in the group.